Okay, excellent. I can see people just arriving now into our room, so thank you very much everyone for joining. I'll start sharing my screen momentarily once we make sure that everyone's in. All right. Looking good. Okay, so looks like we've got a good number of people here. Welcome everybody to our, what we are now, 11th Locked In Learning Taster. Today we're going to be going over creative problem solving and decision making, where we will do it in two parts. So I'm going to start with going over some creative problem solving tools and techniques today. And then on Wednesday, we'll kind of look at how we then make decisions based on what we've found. Okay, so thanks very much for that, Ben. Just to kind of reiterate what you said, this will be a bit of a taster. So there is quite a lot of content that we can cover with regards to creative problem solving, whether it's critical thinking, different ways of thinking, idea generation. So what I've decided to do in this session is just concentrate on a couple of those areas. So what I will do is I'll walk through a couple of different types of thinking and problem solving that we often utilize in our daily basis. And then what I will look to do is concentrate solely on one of those types of thinking, because it's the one that we often don't use enough. So we'll go through a bit of a process that we've adapted from a couple of sources. And I'll tag into a few of those process sections so that you get a few key tools that you can walk away with. One of the things I will do is I did a course on edX not too long ago that was about like critical thinking, and they provided a PDF document of all the different ways in which you can problem solve. So we're just talking through one of the ways in which you can problem solve in a process, but there's lots of different ones. And depending on which kind of industry you're in, you might be familiar with some of them. So what I will do is I will let Kevin have that, and then we can distribute that out to you at the end of the session. So we will do that as well. Okay, so let's get started with the types of problem then. So we generally split this down into two types. So the first one is a convergent problem. So convergent problem is anything that draws to a close. So as the arrows are indicating there, we might have lots of potential options, but what we want to do is draw it down to one potential solution. So having one solution allows us to ensure that we have come to the right agreement, the right solution. Things that fall into a convergent bracket are things like maths problems. They tend to have one solution. You might have different ways of getting there, hence why convergent starts wide and then kind of filters into a point, because yes, there's lots of different ways to do it. However, there's only one solution. It might be an assessment, a test that you're doing. There is generally one solution, or even crosswords. So even though you might have lots of different answers that you might need to provide, the one solution is when that crossword is completed and it looks exactly like the solution that's there. So convergent problems are things that we tend to see quite regularly because people want us to get to one particular goal. And that's the way we kind of operate. But there is other types of problems, and that is divergent problems. And quite the opposite to convergent, they offer us many solutions. And we tend to think that most problems are convergent and we just need to find one solution, when in fact, a lot of things that are presented to us on a daily basis can have many different solutions. So the way in which you go to work, if you're currently going to work, there is more than one solution to get there. So it's a divergent problem. Which way you think is best requires you to go through a number of steps. So what I'm going to do today is just briefly cover convergent problems and how you can solve those more effectively. And then we'll go into divergent problems so that you can get some key aspects about that. So When we're solving convergent problems, we've got a few key steps to take. So there's about 5 in total. So the first one is we need to gather all the information available to us. So you might need to make sure that you go to experts and find out what information they have. You might need to do your own research, or it might just be that you need to use your own experience. So what have you felt on previous occasions? What information have you found in prior situations, and can you use that again? So when we're doing convergent problems, we need to gather all the information together. Then we need to analyze that information. So this is where, excuse me, this is where we need to make sure, is the information that we've gathered relevant to our problem? Because we might be able to find lots of different pieces of information, but do we need to use it or not? Can we segment some of that information and use it at a later time? Is it relevant to us solving our problem right now? So analysis is a key aspect. Is it relevant? Is it useful? Then what we need to do with that information is create some form of logical process. So how can we use all the information to guide us to that solution? So again, if you think about a maths problem, we may think about, all right, I'll gather all my information. What did I learn at school? What did I not learn at school? What do I now need to research because I can't remember how to use Pythagoras theorem or sin cos tan, whatever it might be. Then I need to analyze that and use the figures, the letters that might be presented to me. And then I need to think about a logical process to put them. So what is going to make sense when I lay all these down so that I can come to that solution? What you then need to do is eliminate any options. And this is always a tricky point with convergent problems, because what we tend to do is, because we have some experience, we may eliminate options because they're not favorable to us or we dislike them. And what is important is that you eliminate options based on evidence, not on your assumptions. So even if you've had experience of it, don't always just base it just on a feeling. There's got to be some facts, some evidence that says this information does not fit here, so I'm going to take it out. What is your reasoning for that? And that will guide you. If you just think, let's just move that out, you could then completely miss out on solving that problem. The last point then that you need to do is test that process. So, okay, now that you've got all your information together, you've put it in a process, does it work? So what we need to do is put that process into a test. And then once we're happy with it, what is a good way of doing it is then work it backwards. So does it also work backwards? Because sometimes we might get a false positive where we've, just by chance or by luck, we've got to the right solution. So if you can work it backwards and get to your starting point, then that shows you have done the right steps. So this is kind of a 5-step process just to solving convergent problems. So remember, this is things that have one solution. So once we test it, it should be accurate, and then we can use that for the same type of problem going forwards. Okay, so it shouldn't require us to find out that there's different ways of solving it. So in order to put this to the test a little bit, I'm going to present you with something in a moment. Okay, so those of you that have signed into Poll Everywhere, do that again. So pollev.com/ignitetrain999. It will pop up on the screen shortly as well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to break you off into some groups right now. So maybe I'll put you into about 9 or 10 groups. So there's about 6 of you in a group. Please do make sure that you open up your mic, and I want you to have a discussion about how many squares there are in this picture. So this obviously isn't going to stay visible to you while you're in the breakout rooms, so I am going to put it on the Poll Everywhere. So if you've opened it on a tab or on your phone, that is going to appear momentarily. So if I just do that now and I just check on mine to make sure that so you should be able to see that on Poll Everywhere now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break you out now. So just move to the breakout rooms. And in those rooms, I want you to open up your mics so that you can see each other, speak to each other, and work out how many squares you think. Now, you're not going to be able to type on Poll Everywhere just yet. I'm just using it as a visual. However, after about maybe 4 or 5 minutes, maybe a little bit less than that, I'm then going to change the question. So it'll say, how many squares have you worked out? So as a group, how many do you think? Now you can disagree with your team members and put your own one in, but I want you to all kind of work together to do that. So I'm going to move you into breakout rooms now. It will say, do you want to move into the breakout room? So do say yes, because if you don't, then you stay in a bit of a limbo. And then I will bring you back in around 4 to 5 minutes time. So you'll see a countdown on your screen saying the breakout room is closing, but you can also come back into the main room by clicking the button. So there'll be about 6 or 7 people in each room. I'm going to do that now. Look at your poll everywhere and speak to each other about how many squares are there. Think about what we've just discussed about gathering all the evidence. What experience have people got? Is there a logical process that you can adapt to this? Can you test it? And then do you come to your answer? So I'm going to open all those rooms now. Looks like everyone is back in the room now. On your poll everywhere, you should see that it has now changed to how many squares are there. So I just want you to input your thoughts on that, and then we're just going to go over to the presentation and see what people have put. So I'm just going to share my screen and then just wait for this to refresh. When it does. Slowly, slowly. Okay, so we've got 39. Oh, these are going to come through a bit slow, so let me just change this up a bit. Okay, so we've got quite a few here. We've got 35s, 42s, a few 40s I can see there, 44 just coming in. We've got 51. We've got a few mid-30s as well, 43, 27. Okay, so we've got a bit of a variety there about how many people, how many there is in that. So does anyone care to open up their microphone and say what kind of process they used in order to get there? So in their breakout rooms, what did they discuss with others?
I think initially we just like asked everyone in the team to share what do they think.
Okay, great.
And then I had one member who had more than me, so I asked her, how did you see that? So I took her perspective and recounted to see how did she see more numbers.
Nice. So
yeah, and then we tried to look at it from all different angles to see all the different squares.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, interesting. So you use some good elements of information gathering there. You know, you shared it with one another and tried to work out what you can potentially do differently. You may have tried your own method. So you put your own test in. So sometimes we jump straight to 5 in convergent problem, but then we might need to go back, get some extra information, and then retry that. So that's a good example. Okay, so thanks for opening your mic there. I'm just going to go back to show this screen here where we can see how many squares are there. So for those of you that said 40, that is correct. Okay, so pat on the back if you said 40. If you said anything less than that and you're like, how did they possibly kind of work that out? Well, if I just use my spotlight here, you should be able to see the red dot. So the whole element here is one big square. So firstly, we're looking at squares that are generally equal on all 4 sides. So if we start with the smallest squares first, which I went into one of the breakouts, and sorry, I can't remember who said it now. Always start with the smallest. It's a good process that we can use. So if we start with the smallest squares there are, we can see that there's 4 here, there's 4 here, that's 8. Then we can move up to the next biggest squares, which are these ones. And because it's a 4 by 4, there are 16 of those. And that's nice and easy, but then you may have missed these ones here. So the whole group of these 4 is also a small square. So sometimes that's what people miss. Then it's probably best to go by a 2 by 2, matrix. So then we go here, there is a 2 by 2 here, then there is one in the middle there, then there is one on this side here, so that adds up. Then you move down one because you can do a 2 by 2 here, you can do a 2 by 2 there, and a 2 by 2 there, and then you move to the bottom where you can do a 2 by 2 there, 2 by 2 in the middle, 2 by 2 there. Then you go to threes, so you go out to 3, which goes all the way around there, and you can do one from that corner as well, one from the bottom corner, so that's all 3 by 3s, and then that final one in that bottom corner there. And then lastly, you have your 4 by 4, your whole square in a row. So if you want to look at that, you know, it's easy, just type in how many squares are there on Google and you'll see many of these kind of pictures, and you can utilize one that looks like this to make sure that you count that there is 40. So the reason I use that is because, yes, it is an example of convergent. There is one solution. You just need to make sure that you use all the information available to you. Okay, so just to move quickly forward then to our next one. So just might need to stop sharing this a moment and move over. Great. So it just wasn't moving past this process. So here's where we now look at divergent problems. So the one that we don't seem to utilize as much. So what I'm going to go through here is a bit of a adaptation of Graham Wallace's process on divergent problems. So he wrote a book called The Art of Thought, where he came up with 4 stages of a process. What we've done here is we've just adapted them ever so slightly to get you thinking about different aspects. But what I am going to do is focus on 3 of those key elements with you. So just going through this process then, the first part of a divergent process is identification. So this is where you really need to identify, well, what is your problem, and try to get down to the crux of why that problem exists. So most of the time our problem is brought to us. So what we might need to do is understand from that person, why does this problem exist? Why do we need to deal with this problem? And then think about, well, what can we do differently with this problem? Because the way in which one person brings you the problem might not always be the full story. So it's really important to kind of think about, you know, what is the problem they have? What do they want to solve? What would be their ideal solution? Because if they give you a bit of an ideal solution, you might be able to then backtrack and go, well, that solution might not fit this problem. So tell me a little bit more. What we tend to find is most problems have some form of human desire within there. So if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that pyramid, most problems easily fit into those. So if we identify which of those stages this person is at, you know, is it a problem with their safety? So, you know, a problem we have right now is, you know, coronavirus. How do we kind of keep it contained? That is very much a safety concern. So it's one of the lowest tier problems that we can have from a human need. If we think of something like, how can I best show my family that I have achieved lots in my career, that is probably higher up that hierarchy when we're looking at kind of self-actualization. So understanding where that problem fits in is a good place to start, because then we can look at addressing other concerns. So we need to investigate, we need to ask questions, and that's one of the next steps that I'm going to show you after this, is using the Socratic method, which is a questioning technique, how you can understand more about a problem. So we'll go through a 6-phase process there. Then we go to a stage of idea generation, and again, this is a phase that we're going to touch upon, and because I'm going to give you some ways in which you can kind of come up with different ideas moving forwards, rather than just what we think is the general way of doing things. There is a stage there where there's inspiration. So what Graham Wallace did kind of refer to is there is an amazing stage between idea generation and inspiration that also takes place. And it's kind of like a dotted line that goes from one to the other. And that's a process of incubation. So what we often think about is we think we have to come up with solutions there and then on the spot, or we're given a time period and we said, all right, you need to find a solution by then. And it's not always the best way in which the mind operates, because what we need to do is we need to use our unconscious mind. So there is so little known about our unconscious mind. You know, we're quite aware that we use about 9% of our brains, and that's usually what we display when we are conscious. So there is lots of unconscious elements within the brain that is utilized. So a great example here is Archimedes. So Archimedes used to take lots of baths, and when he got in the bath, he knew that the water rose when he got in the bath, and he knew that it sank again when he got out of the bath. But he never paid any attention. And it wasn't until he was tasked with finding out how much gold currently resides in the king's crown. And again, he struggled to find a solution, to find out how much gold is actually in it. How can he find a decent process in order to work that out? So what he did do is when he got into the bath and he saw that the water rose when he got in it, he had a light bulb moment, which is his incubation is set, his inspiration appears. If he uses water and drops the crown in the water, you will see how much the water raised, so we'll be able to assess what volume the crown takes up, so then assess how much gold is in it. So that's where Eureka comes from, as he jumped out of the bath naked and ran around trying to put that into words so that he could say that he could measure the king's crown gold volume. So there's a key way in which incubation plays a key role. There's also another story that goes around when Henry Ford is taking an auditor around his factory, and there is a guy sat in an office with his feet up on the table looking up at the ceiling, hands clasped together in thought. And the auditor said, is that what you pay that man to do? Surely he's costing you money. And Henry Ford said, the last time he sat like that in the office, he saved me thousands of pounds. Obviously back then, thousands of pounds was a lot more, or dollars, I think it was. And again, it's because in that moment, that person was just looking at the ceiling, not really giving any thought, just letting his unconscious mind do that. So there is this this forgotten element of the process of thinking, where we need to go away and move on to another task, do something different, and then usually inspiration comes from that. Then we need to go through a process of evaluation. So what method is likely to work best? And this sometimes is where a convergent process can come into play. So just like we did earlier, with evaluation, even in a divergent process, what you can then start to do is, okay, what evidence have I got about these potential ideas? What could work? Let me put a logical process in place to see which one can get me to a solution. Now, that doesn't mean that the process you put in place there, evaluation, is the correct one, because remember, in divergent process, there are many solutions. So although in evaluation we're trying to converge our thoughts from lots of different ideas and focus it into one potential idea, we've always got to remember that we might need to cycle back and revisit another idea or come up with a different logical process for that. So once we evaluate, then we can implement, and hopefully that's when we get a pat on the back for solving the problem, but it still allows us to potentially implement something and not get to the desired solution, because what we think might work might require some extra thought. So then we can go through that cycle again. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly go into identification and investigation and kind of tie these in. So I did mention we we're going to go through the Socratic method of questioning, and that's kind of what we're going to look at. So let's look at these two. Here's 6 aspects that you should always do when you're looking to solve a problem so that you can understand more about the situation. So clarify people's thinking and their understanding. So use some of these key questions, such as, can you give me an example of when this has worked before? Can you give me an example of what you'd like to see as a result of this problem? Could you explain further? Because what people tend to do is they don't always give us all the information that they have. They might just kind of have a brain dump from themselves and just go there and just spit out some information. And it doesn't quite give us everything that we need. So again, could you explain further is a good way to kind of get them to tell you more. Are you saying this and then repeat what they've said is a great way for them to understand what they may have told you. So we're all human beings. We don't always listen in the correct way all of the time. So even though we should be actively listening in this point when someone is telling us a problem, it might be that we're passive listening or selectively listening. So it's always good to repeat back to that person by saying, are you saying this? And rephrase their problem, because that might help them say, yes, that's exactly what I'm asking for. No, I'm not. You might come up with a small idea when you rephrase it and they go, oh, no, actually, that's a good way of putting it. Let's look at the problem in that aspect. So it's always good to rephrase what it is. If all else fails, go to the simple question of, what's the problem that you're trying to solve, and get them to kind of put it in a different format. It's always good to try and clarify in those ways. Challenge any assumptions, and it's always the key aspect. If you have read any other books on creative thinking, I've read quite a bit on How to Think Like Einstein, and so there's a few little bits tied within this small short course here. But he always challenged what were the general assumptions here. So in that book, there is an element called breaking the rules. So, all these assumptions that we have that we can't do something this way, or, we're limited in this aspect. Money is always a key one. We always go, we're limited by money. But why should that stop us from doing anything? Try and think of your problem in a different way and go, all right, well, if money was limitless, what would you do with it? And sometimes even from some of those ideas, you'll come up with some form of solution where you can go, do you know what? We don't actually need as much money as we thought to be able to do that problem. We might be able to get an in-house solution to that. So it's always worthwhile kind of flipping things, challenging your own assumptions. But when you're questioning people about their problem, use these key phrases as well. Is this always the case? Because the problem that they come to you might be, every time we do this, this happens. Is that always the case? Well, no, it's not always the case. How can you focus on some of those other situations when it doesn't always happen? How can you replicate those scenarios to overlap what the problem might be? So again, asking if it's always the case is key. Are you assuming? So putting the word assuming into your questioning immediately makes the other person think that they're making an assumption. So they might correct themselves and go, well, do you know what? No, maybe we are kind of jumping the gun. Maybe we shouldn't think like that. So again, use assuming within your questioning to help make the other person think differently. How could you verify or disprove that? So again, think back to convergent problems. We're looking at removing any information that's not helpful to us. So we can do that here. How can you verify certain facts? How can you disprove opinions? And then what would happen if? So what if is always a great way to phrase things, because then people think differently. So if there's anything I would say to take away from this, always think about what if, because it's a great way for us to think wider and broader. Examine your evidence and any rationales that you have. So why do you say that? Why is it important? How do you know that this happens? How do you know this information? So always a key thing that we should be asking people. We take people's word as verbatim. What they say is the truth. And it's not always the truth. It just might be their truth, or it could just be their opinion. So how do you know that? Why? And what evidence have you got that supports it is always a great way to challenge some problems. If we move on to the other side, going on to our fourth one now, what alternative perspectives do we have? So what alternatives are there? Asking the person who's giving you the problem what alternatives are there gives you some scope and movement about where you can go. Always look at things from the other side of the argument. And this is a great thing to take away in life as well as anything else, is we're always governed by our own perspectives. So what's interesting is to consider someone else's perspective, and you might come up with ideas that you would never thought of because you're too self-involved in your own perspective. So what are the other sides of the argument? What are the other perspectives of others that you can take on board? What makes your viewpoint better than others? So again, it gets someone to justify rather than just saying it and you having to take it at face value. What kind of governs that? Why should you believe what they're saying? And then always a nice thing is who would be affected and what would they think? Because again, you're changing your perspective. So we might make this judgment now, we might come up with this solution, but what are the impacts on other people down the line? What would they say? What would they do? Can that change the way in which we approach this problem? Or is that just the way it needs to be? Then we need to consider implications and consequences. So again, asking it outright is nice and easy. But then thinking, what are the after effects? So with divergent thinking, because there's so many solutions, we also need to think about what are the effects of that. So what could this cause? What could be the output of this? Is that a desire that we have, or is it something that we didn't think about and is a good byproduct, or is it a bad byproduct? And then what does experience tell us? So again, what do we know that's happened before that may happen again? And again, this is all to help with your kind of investigation. So it's not that you're saying our experience tells us this doesn't work, because, you know, history has told us that people's experience always changes. You know, there was a gentleman at the US Patent Office in about 1904, I think it was, who said, all that's been invented has been invented. And that was over 110 years ago now, and think about what's changed now. So our experience will always change. It's not always as clear-cut as it seems right now. And then think about meta questions, so the bigger picture questions. Asking someone why you think you asked that question, so why do you think I asked that question, gets them to think about your question and what potential solutions could come out of that. So it's always good to try and think of high level thinking. What does whatever the problem or the solution mean? You know, so getting them thinking about it in more detail. What's the point of the question? So again, it drives down into what is the real desire that someone has here. And then what else do you think I could ask? So that's always a key way to do that. So if you're wondering where some of those come from, just down in the bottom there, it's a bit small, but that's from the Thinker's Guide to the Art of Socratic Thinking by R.W. Paul and L. Elder. So you can get lots of information on Socratic questioning, obviously coming from Socrates, a Greek philosopher and teacher, and this was his way of truly understanding what people want and how to get to the crux of what someone's desires are. So using these questions can help you identify and explore some of those problems. If we move on to idea generation, this is where we can discuss some of the key tools which we can go through. So I'm just going to quickly ask you guys, how do you generate ideas and what techniques and tools do you use? So on Poll Everywhere, that should now be visible. And then I'm just going to change my screen so that it shows all of it. So any thoughts on that? And this should refresh. And then we'll get some answers. Okay, great. Brainstorming, always a good one. Just going to try and hurry this up again. The cursor's gone. Great. Brainstorming, reflection, small group brainstorming, always good. Mind mapping is coming up. Yeah, using your past experience, researching, always good ideas. Focus groups, networking is always good. You know, using your network, using the people there, just asking people in a particular room that you might go to, or Zoom call maybe. Go bathing, yeah, thanks. Do doing Archimedes. Yeah, asking everyone questions for ideas, relating it to a different subject. That's a great one, relating to a different subject, because it gets us thinking in a different way. Asking always good, simple questions, going back to Socrates. So don't worry if you've added a few there. I know it's kind of stopped. I'm going to walk through a couple of ideas and then we're going to quickly put some into practice. So here's a 5 key idea generation techniques from me. So the first one is brainstorming, which appeared on our list there. So great.
Ben, you know your screen's not shared.
Oh, isn't it? Sorry.
There you go.
Yep. All right, great. Sorry. So brainstorming is a great way. So that's what a lot of people said on that list. Brainstorming is just a way of getting in ideally small groups, because you don't want too many people kind of putting their ideas in, just seeing what information floats around the room. So it's always good to make sure that you've got your problem identified and clarified, so that the people coming to the brainstorming know what they're going to be discussing. And then it's just all about floating key aspects around. If you want to make it a little bit more specific and in-depth, then go to mind mapping, which was also mentioned on our list. And that's when you kind of put your problem in the center and then draw off lines for different avenues that you might go down, different possible solutions that you might come to. And where there's any sort of links between any of those aspects of your map, linking them up, maybe drawing around them in the same color, so it's color coded, so it brings it to life a little bit more. Our mind has a great way of linking things together when it sees it visually. So any sort of visualization like mind mapping is extremely useful to use. Replacing things with random words is a good way to do it, and it's one that people kind of go, why would I do that? So if you've got something like, you know, how do I solve hunger in the world? Add in some random words. So how would I solve hunger with paperback books? Something like that. And what it allows you to do is create connections that you wouldn't even dream of doing because it's too random. So you might think, well, with books, you know, we could write an amazing novel which goes through the hardships of hunger and famine and try to inspire some people who are more affluent to give more. So very apt within Ramadan to make sure that you're giving more. But using things like that can help you link ideas. You could also think about writing a guide in a paperback book to help people grow their own food in areas that are more impoverished. So linking things back using random words and phrases helps you create some form of link between your problem, and then go, well, could I use something similar? Might not be obviously the same word that you've used randomly, but you can use the same process. Creating a disaster, well, I suppose at this moment in time we don't need to create a disaster, we've got one, but it's a prime example of how people can do things differently. So again, if you're from one of those workplaces that said, no, you can't work from home because your job doesn't work well when it's working from home, and now you've proved them wrong, it's because of a disaster that has happened. You know, the world is working in a completely different way now than what it was just a few months ago, because we've been kind of impacted by a pandemic. So when you've got your problem, create a disaster to overlay it in your mind, and how would you overcome that obstacle? So what if there was a flash flood? How would you still look to solve your problem if all the areas were flooded? What would you look to do? And it doesn't matter how silly it sounds, and you might go, well, do you know what, getting to work quicker, if I was flooded, then I'd have to get myself a canoe or a kayak, or I'd get myself a powerboat. Just by going through some of those ideas, it's all that kind of generation that we need to think about different ideas. When incubation happens is when our unconscious mind might start taking links. The sillier the idea, the more likely something is going to come from it, because we have a great way of connecting humor with ideas. So try and make it as silly as possible. It sounds stupid at first, but it does help you bring about different solutions. And then a great way to do it is, how would you fix this problem with a pocket knife? So if any of you are familiar with Swiss Army knives or pocket knives, especially ones that have got many gadgets coming off them, toothpicks, tweezers, different types of knives, all sorts, mini torch sometimes on the newer ones. How could you use elements of that Swiss Army pocket knife to help solve your problem? So again, you know, could you use the screwdriver to unscrew elements of the chair that you're sitting on and make something new out of it? Stupid little things to make you think differently are all good ways to try and generate ideas. So just 5 key aspects there. There is plenty more. Again, just a simple Google search will give you many more different ideas. They all sound silly, but that's because most of them help bring about better solutions. I can't remember who said it now off the top of my head, but they said when they're looking at problem solving, they're not looking for the word eureka, they're looking for the words "that's funny." Because once we say "that's funny," it gets our mind thinking, going, well, if it's fun, how can I actually make use of it? So do think about some of those last 3 aspects there that will help you. So that's when we kind of move into inspiration, where things can kind of come to life from some of those ideas. So the last thing that I want to just prompt you with, we've only got a couple of minutes, but hopefully anyone that can stay can just help with this. I'm just going to throw you quickly into a breakout room where I will show you this problem on your Polev as well. So just to kind of give you an overview, A's home is 5 miles from work. Their car gets 20 kilometers per litre. However, they wish to use less fuel in their travel, both for monetary gain and for environmental reasons, but money is not an issue for them to get a solution. What choices do they have to cut their fuel consumption? So think about different ways in which you can do that, and I want you to just have a couple of minutes speaking in groups again, where you can find out different ways to do this. So I'm going to show this problem on Poll Everywhere so that you can all read that. And I'm just going to break you out into rooms now. So I'll just recreate these again. So it'll only be a couple of minutes. Have a quick discussion what you can do different. And then we'll just have a quick review and close ready for implementation, which will be decision making. Okay, so it looks like most people are back in now. So let's just see this refresh, and hopefully we will be able to see some of those answers, see what people did. All right, great. So yeah, move closer to work could very well be an option. Work from home definitely saves some mileage and is good for the environment as well. Carpooling is a great example. Yeah, cycling instead, get a bit of exercise as well as doing better for the environment. Use Uber or Careem so we can support our kind of wider people, but again, it might not help with those environmental reasons if you're using a car, because they have to drive to you, drive there, and then drive somewhere else. But good kind of thinking outside of that. We've got another move house, bike, yeah. And then if money is not an issue, an electric car, fuel efficient hybrid. So these are all great examples, but again, we're kind of thinking within our own realms of what we can do. You know, hire Elon Musk. There you go. There's an idea. But as much as it sounds silly, that's kind of the right way to start thinking, because it's like, all right, well, what would Elon Musk do in this? All right, he'd try and sell you a Tesla, but you know, how can you think differently? So, you know, if we've got any film fans out there, how could you create a Back to the Future car? How could you create the DeLorean? You know, can you use the waste in your house by building a different converter in your car? Again, money's not an option, so yeah, get people in. Ultimately, you might be able to save the environment by using all kind of general compostable waste maybe to fuel your car. So just by thinking a little bit differently like that, I'm not saying they're the solutions, but it gets you thinking in a different way. So yeah, we can start to look at how we can do things a little bit differently. You know, yeah, change job. You know, that might sound silly, but you know, when we think about human needs, is it that they're enjoying the current job that they're in? Do they need to drive that far? What if they try to work from home by starting their own business up? You know, what's their expertise? So we slowly move from just not wanting to be environmentally friendly and saving money in the way in which they travel, but actually working out how can they actually do something different personally that's going to help them do that, but also satisfy their own human needs. So just by exploring those options, we get different kind of ways of thinking. So that kind of goes around some of our divergent process. So as we discussed at the start, this was only a very light touch on some of these aspects. We do go into more detail if you join us on any of our locked-in learnings about how we can utilize these tools more effectively. We will be moving a little bit more into implementation on our next session, which is upcoming at the end of this week. So the free webinars that we have on our slide right now are for next week and the week after. This Wednesday at 10 to 11, we actually have the second part of this webinar. But then you can see that we've got one on the 18th of May for 5 dysfunctions of a team. We've got one on the 20th of May about presentation skills, so how we can utilize those a little bit more effectively. And then we're going to take a break over Eid, as I'm sure most of you will be taking some time at that as well. And then when we return in June, we'll be doing a bit on servant leadership, and then we'll be having an expert panel on sales on the 3rd of June. So that's something good to look forward to. So I'd like to take this moment just to say thank you for attending today. There is a poll just up at the moment on the presentation, but it won't be there for too long. If it's not showing on mine. It will be kind of down shortly. So any feedback that you can offer on that, please do. If you want to type in the chat, that is also an option. I know we're very much over time here, Ben, but are there any key questions that have popped up on the chat function at all?
No questions.
Okay, all right. Well, I've already taken up 8-9 minutes more of your time, so I just want to take this moment again to thank you for attending our webinars, and yes, hopefully see you for part 2, where we talk about putting these into practice for decision making. Thank you for everyone at Ignite, and enjoy your day.